Hey guys, welcome back to more Malicious Compliance Reddit stories. In today's Ripe Stories video, imagine a new manager so obsessed with cutting costs that she bans you from arriving at work on time, leaving the shelves completely empty. She promoted herself to the position of CEO and thought that she was smarter than everyone else. Well, here is what happened when her rules totally backfired. Let's dive right into today's video. And the first one is titled, Karen Manager Promotes Herself to CEO. Ends in disaster. Posted on r/MaliciousCompliance. So I work in a very successful family-owned bakery and catering company. We are located in a busy commercial area with a massive amount of foot traffic, and we also handle large catering events like weddings, corporate lunches, and big holiday parties. I have been with this company for a very long time already. I started out washing dishes and scrubbing floors, and eventually I worked my way up to being the head baker and kitchen supervisor, and I know every single recipe by heart. I know exactly how our massive commercial ovens behave, I know which local suppliers have the best seasonal fruits, and I know exactly how long it takes to prepare a high-end meal for 500 people. The owner of the business is a fantastic guy. He built the bakery from the ground up, and in the early days he was always in the kitchen with us, covered in flour, making sure everything was perfect. He treated his employees very well, paid us fairly, and always had our backs when customers were being unreasonable. Unfortunately, his wife became very ill and she needed constant care and frequent trips to out-of-state specialists. The owner quickly realized he could not run a high-volume bakery and take care of his wife at the same time, so he made the difficult decision to step back from the day-to-day operations. He wanted to keep the business in the family and not sell it, so he decided to hire a general manager to run the place while he focused entirely on his personal life. This is where the absolute nightmare begins. The owner interviewed a few people and eventually hired a woman from outside the company. I will just call her the new manager. She had a background in retail management and claimed during her interview to have extensive experience in optimizing small businesses and increasing profit margins. That already sounds like a massive red flag, by the way, if you ask me, guys. Either way, the owner trusted her resume and handed her the keys to the kingdom, so to say. He called a staff meeting and told everyone that she was in charge of the schedule, the ordering, the front of house, and the business accounts. He told her to trust me and the other senior staff with the kitchen operations because we knew exactly what we were doing. Then he left to take care of his wife. On her very first day, the new manager walked in looking like she was about to attend a board meeting as a massive Wall Street corporation. She wore an incredibly formal outfit and high heels. Wearing high heels is a terrible idea, by the way, in a commercial bakery where the floors are often slippery with spilled flour, water, or oil, and she immediately complained about the smell of the kitchen. She said the scent of active yeast and roasting meats was overwhelming and asked if we could open some windows to air the place out. I had to politely explain that opening the windows would mess with the temperature and humidity in the kitchen, which would completely ruin the bread dough we were currently proofing. She rolled her eyes, sighed loudly, and told me to just figure it out, and her first real order of business was not to learn how the bakery operated. She did not ask to see our recipes, she didn't ask about daily volume, and she didn't introduce herself to the regular customers. Instead, she decided to completely remodel the owner's small, modest office in the back of the building. She ordered a massive new desk, an expensive ergonomic chair, a new computer setup, and had the walls repainted. We were all a bit confused because the owner usually just used a small desk in the corner of the dry storage room to do his paperwork. He liked being close to the action so he could jump in and help if the counter got busy, but the new manager wanted a closed door and a quiet, isolated space, and by the end of her first week, I received an email from her regarding a minor schedule change for the dishwashers. I scrolled down to read the bottom of the email and my jaw dropped when I saw her email signature. It didn't say General Manager, it said Chief Executive Officer. I thought it was a joke or a typo. I mean, this was a bakery and catering company. We were a limited liability company owned entirely by one guy. There was no board of directors, there were no shareholders, there was no corporate ladder, there was absolutely no CEO. And a few days later, a heavy box arrived in the mail. The front counter staff opened it thinking it was a shipment of the custom labels we used for pastry boxes, but instead it was a massive stack of premium thick business cards. They had the company logo on them, and right in the middle in bold gold lettering was the new manager's name, followed by the title Chief Executive Officer. I took one of the cards, walked into her newly remodeled office. I knocked on the door, stepped inside, and asked her politely about the title change. I told her that the owner had just introduced her as the new general manager, and I was confused about the new business cards. She leaned back in her expensive chair, looked at me with a very condescending expression, and sighed. She told me that the title of general manager was outdated and didn't reflect the true scope of her responsibilities. She said she was modernizing our corporate structure to align with industry standards, and she explained that since she was making all the executive financial decisions while the owner was away, she was the de facto CEO of the company. She then told me that I should focus on baking my little cakes and leave the complex corporate strategy to her. I just nodded and walked out. If she wanted to play pretend corporate executive in a bakery, that was fine with me, as long as she let me run the kitchen the way it needed to be run, but of course that did not happen. The new manager decided that her first major act as CEO would be to drastically increase our profit margins. She did not try to achieve this by increasing sales, launching a marketing campaign, or even finding new catering clients. She decided to do it by aggressively cutting costs in the kitchen. For years we had used a specific local dairy farm for our milk, heavy cream and butter, and their products were amazing. The butter had a very high fat content, which is absolutely essential for making good croissants, puff pastry, and buttercream frosting. We also used a regional mill for our flour because the protein content was incredibly consistent, which meant our bread always turned out perfectly every single time. These ingredients were slightly more expensive than standard supermarket stuff, but they were the entire reason our bakery was so popular. People could taste the quality and they were willing to pay a premium price for it. During our third week, the delivery truck from the local dairy farm didn't show up at its usual time. I went to the office and asked the new manager if she knew why they were late, and she proudly informed me that she had cancelled our contract with them, and she had also cancelled our contract with the regional flour mill and our supplier for fresh local produce. She handed me a printed list of our new suppliers, and it was a massive national wholesale distributor known for providing the absolute cheapest, lowest quality bulk food to institutional cafeterias and budget diners, but I tried to stay calm. I sat down in the chair opposite her massive desk and tried to explain the basic science of baking to her, and I explained that if we use cheap butter with a high water content, the croissants will not flake properly, the water in the cheap butter will turn to steam too quickly in the oven, and the butter will melt out onto the baking sheet and the pastries will be dense, flat and greasy. I explained to her that cheap wholesale flour has inconsistent protein levels, which means our bread dough might not rise properly or might become far too tough to chew. I told her that our customers pay a premium price for our products because they expect premium ingredients. She held up her hand to stop me from talking, and she told me that I was being resistant to change and that I lacked business vision. She said that regular customers don't know actually the difference between local butter and wholesale butter, and she claimed it was all just marketing nonsense. So yeah, she told me that her new contracts would save the company thousands of dollars a month, which would look fantastic on her quarterly reports, and I told her that we would lose our entire customer base if the food tasted bad. She got very angry. She stood up, leaned over her desk and told me that she was the CEO of this company. She said she made the financial decisions and my job was simply to follow her instructions without questioning her authority. She told me to take the cheap ingredients and figure out a way to make them work. I knew arguing was completely pointless. I also knew that if I just went along with it and the recipes failed, she would absolutely try to blame me for ruining the food. I needed to protect myself and my kitchen staff. I looked at her and told her that if she wanted me to completely change our ingredient sourcing against my professional advice, I needed it in writing. I told her I would not accept the new deliveries or change the recipes unless she gave me a formal written directive stating that I must use these specific wholesale ingredients and that I was strictly forbidden from ordering from our old suppliers. She scoffed at me, called me dramatic and sat back down at her computer. 10 minutes later I received an email from her. It was sent to the entire staff and it stated clearly that she was the chief executive officer. It stated that all ingredient orders must go through her new approved vendor list, and it explicitly forbade anyone from contacting our old suppliers. It ended with a strict warning that any deviation from her approved vendor list would be considered gross insubordination and would result in immediate termination. I printed that email out. I printed 3 of those copies. I put one in my locker, one in my car, and one in a folder I kept in my desk. The malicious compliance had officially begun. The ingredient change was bad enough, but then she decided to mess with the labor schedule. Baking is a very time-sensitive process, and to have fresh bread and pastries ready for our customers when we open the doors at 7 in the morning, the kitchen staff needs to arrive very early in the dark. My shift usually started at 3 in the morning. The rest of the baking team would arrive between 3 and 4, and we needed that time to mix the dough, let it proof, shape it, let it proof again, and bake it. You cannot rush this process. The new manager looked at the payroll and noticed that we were paying a slight shift differential for the early morning hours, and she decided that this was an unnecessary expense. She posted a new schedule on the bulletin board next to the time clock, and she had moved everyone's start time to 6 in the morning. I immediately went back to her office and I explained that if we start at 6, the bread will not be out of the oven until at least 9 or 10, and the morning rush would be completely over. Customers would walk in to buy morning breakfast and croissants, and the display cases would be completely empty, and she told me that I was exaggerating. She said I just needed to work faster, and she told me to optimize my workflow and stop taking so many breaks and stop wasting company time. I tried to explain that you cannot force yeast to work faster. Dough needs time to rise. It's a biological process, not a manufacturing assembly line. You cannot just turn up the speed on a mixer and expect the bread to be ready in half the time. She refused to listen though. She told me that as the new CEO, she had determined that the early morning shifts were a waste of company resources, and she said the new schedule was final, and once again, I asked for it in writing. She rolled her eyes, opened her email, and sent another company-wide memo. She stated no employee was allowed to clock in before 6 in the morning without her explicit written permission. She stated that anyone clocking in early would be written up for stealing company time, and I printed that email and added it to my growing folder. The next day we all arrived at 6 in the morning and we clocked in exactly when she told us to. The front counter staff arrived at 6:30 to set up the registers and the coffee machines, and we opened the front doors at 7. The large display cases were completely empty. In the kitchen we were working as fast as humanly possible, but we were just starting to mix the dough. The cheap wholesale flour was behaving strangely, just as I predicted. It was absorbing water differently than our old flour, making the dough sticky and incredibly hard to handle. By 7:15, the store was full of angry commuters wanting their breakfast. The front counter staff had to apologize repeatedly, explaining the bakers were running late. Customers were frustrated, many of them just walked out and went to a chain bakery down the street, and we finally got the first batch of croissants into the oven around 8:30. When they baked, the cheap wholesale butter performed exactly as I knew it would. It melted rapidly out of the dough and pooled on the baking sheets. And the croissants were flat, dense and swimming in grease, and they looked terrible, but I put them on a tray and brought them out to the display case. The few customers who were still waiting bought them, but we immediately started getting complaints. People came back to the counter saying the pastries tasted like cardboard and cheap oil, and the new manager came out of her office around 9, and she saw the empty display cases, the angry customers and the terrible-looking pastries. She stormed into the kitchen and started yelling at me, and she demanded to know why the food was late and why the croissants looked so bad. So I opened my folder, pulled out her 2 printed emails, and I handed them to her. I told her that we could not start baking until 6 in the morning, and per her strict schedule, I also told her that the croissants were flat because we were using the cheap butter that she mandated. I reminded her that I had warned her about both these exact outcomes, and she had ordered me to follow her instructions anyway, but she snatched the paper out of my hand, her face turning bright red, and told me to just figure out a way to make it work. She refused to change the schedule and refused to change the suppliers. This became our new normal. Our daily sales plummeted, regular customers stopped coming in entirely, and our online reviews tanked. People were leaving comments saying the bakery had gone downhill, the food was always late, and the quality was terrible. The new manager responded to these reviews online by arguing with the customers, telling them they had unrefined palates and that our new recipes were actually much better. It was incredibly embarrassing for all of us. To make matters worse though, she decided to get involved in the catering deliveries. We had 2 small delivery vans that we used to transport food to local offices and event venues, and our drivers were experienced. They knew the local roads and they knew which streets had too many potholes, and they knew how to drive carefully when transporting delicate items like tiered cakes. The new manager decided that our drivers were wasting gas by taking inefficient routes. She found a free online route mapping tool and started printing out exact turn-by-turn directions for every single delivery, and she mandated that the drivers must follow her printed routes exactly, and she installed cheap GPS trackers in the vans to ensure they didn't deviate. And one Saturday we had a delivery for a beautiful 3-tier birthday cake, and the venue was across town. The driver knew that the main highway was the best route because the roads were smooth, even though it was technically a few miles longer. The new manager's mapping tool, however, calculated that taking a series of back roads and residential streets was shorter and would save a tiny amount of gas. That sounds like, by the way, the average Google Maps experience in many Asian countries. For some reason here, Google really loves recommending you to take residential small streets instead of the big ones just to save like 1 or 2 minutes, and usually you don't save anything. Either way, if you still enjoy these malicious compliance stories, please don't forget to like the video and maybe even post a comment if you want to support real voice readers. Thank you so much. Anyway, the driver tried to explain that the back roads were full of speed bumps and potholes which would destroy the cake, but the manager gave her standard speech. She was the CEO, she made the rules, and the driver needed to follow the printed route or else face disciplinary action. She put it in writing, handing the driver a signed sheet of paper with the route and a warning not to deviate from it. The driver complied with it. He took the back roads, he drove as slowly and carefully as he could, but the speed bumps were unavoidable. By the time he arrived at the venue, the top tier of the cake had shifted and the delicate buttercream decorations were completely smashed against the side of the cardboard box. The customer was furious and called the bakery to demand a full refund. The manager tried to blame the driver for reckless driving, but the driver simply produced a signed paper proving he had just taken the exact route she forced him to take. The manager had to refund the entire cost of the cake, losing the company hundreds of dollars to save maybe 50 cents on gas, but she still refused to admit that she was wrong. All of this was just a warm-up for the main event though. A few months before the owner left, he had secured a massive catering contract for a very high-profile wedding. The bride's family was very wealthy and very influential in our city, and they had booked our premium catering package. This included a massive grazing table for a cocktail hour, a 3-course plated dinner for 300 guests, and a huge intricate 5-tier wedding cake. This contract was worth a lot of money, and it was crucial for our reputation. The owner had already taken the deposit and finalized the menu with the bride before he stepped away, and when the wedding was about 2 weeks away, the new manager decided that she needed to take complete control of the event. She saw the budget for the wedding and decided she could massively increase the profit margin by applying her cost-cutting strategies to this event. She called me into her office and handed me a revised ingredient list and a revised prep schedule for the wedding. I looked at the papers and felt sick to my stomach. For the grazing table, the bride had paid for imported cheeses and cured meats and fresh local fruits. The manager's new list replaced all of that with cheap pre-sliced deli meats, blocks of processed cheddar cheese, and canned fruit. For the main course, the bride had selected a high-end cut of beef with a wild mushroom reduction. The manager had changed the order to the absolute cheapest, toughest cut of wholesale beef she could find and replaced the wild mushrooms with canned button mushrooms and artificial truffle flavoring. For the wedding cake, the manager had ordered a cheap bucket-sized tub of artificial vanilla extract instead of the pure vanilla bean paste we always used, and she also ordered cheap hydrogenated vegetable shortening for the frosting instead of real butter. I put the paper down on her desk, I looked her right in the eye and told her that we absolutely couldn't do this. I explained that this was a premium contract and the bride had done a tasting months ago. She knew exactly what the food was supposed to taste like. If we served her cheap deli meat and tough beef, she would refuse to pay the final bill, and she would destroy our reputation in the community. I also pointed out the prep schedule, and the manager had only scheduled the kitchen staff for one regular shift the day before the wedding to prep everything. A dinner for 300 people requires days of prep work. We needed to marinate the meat, bake the cake layers in advance so they could cool, make the frostings, prep hundreds of appetizers. One shift was mathematically impossible, but the manager slammed her hand on the desk. She told me she was sick and tired of my constant insubordination. She said that as the CEO, she had a fiduciary duty to maximize profits, and she claimed that wedding guests are usually drunk anyway and will not notice the difference between expensive cheese and cheap cheese. She said the bride had already signed the contract and paid the deposit, so we had the money locked in. I told her that this was a recipe for complete disaster. I told her I wouldn't put my name on food that tasted like garbage, so she stood up, walked over to the door and closed it. She turned to me and spoke in a very quiet, very angry voice. She told me that I was just a cook, and she told me that I had no understanding of business. She said that if I refused to follow her exact instructions for this wedding, she would fire me on the spot for gross insubordination. I took a deep breath. I realized there was no saving this situation. She was determined to drive the business into a brick wall, and I was not gonna let her throw me under the bus when the crash happened. I looked at her and said, I understand, but because this is a major deviation from the agreed upon contract with the client, I need your instructions in writing. I need a formal document stating that I'm required to use these specific ingredients and follow this specific schedule, and that I'm not authorized to make any changes. She sneered at me, she sat down on her computer, typed furiously for a few minutes, and she printed out a document on the company's official paper. It was a formal reprimand and a direct order. It stated that I'd been challenging her authority, and it stated that she was the chief executive officer and had final say over all catering operations. It explicitly listed the cheap ingredients I was forced to use and the exact restricted hours I was allowed to schedule my staff for prep. It ended with a bolded sentence stating that any failure to follow these instructions would result in my immediate termination, and she signed it at the bottom. I took the paper, read it carefully and folded it. I put it in my pocket, I looked at her and said, "Understood, I will follow your instructions exactly to the letter." The malicious compliance was now locked and loaded for the biggest event of the year. The day before the wedding, we arrived for our single allowed prep shift. The kitchen staff was panicking. They looked at the massive pile of cheap ingredients and the impossible timelines, and I gathered everyone around. I told them to take a deep breath, and I explained that we were gonna do exactly what the manager ordered us to do. We were not gonna rush, we were not gonna stress ourselves out, and we were not gonna perform any miracles. We would just work at a normal, safe pace, and whatever got done, got done. We started baking the cake layers because we are using the cheap wholesale flour and the cheap shortening. The cakes baked up dense and heavy. They did not have the light fluffy texture they were supposed to have, and when we made the frosting with the artificial vanilla and shortening, it tasted like sweet plastic. It left a greasy film on the roof of your mouth. We started prepping the appetizers. We opened the packages of cheap deli meat and arranged them on the platters. It looked like a cheap supermarket platter for a football game, not a high-end wedding grazing table. We opened the large cans of fruit and drained the syrup. It looked sad and completely unappetizing. We prepped the beef. It was a terrible cut of meat. It was full of gristle and connective tissue. Normally, a cut like this needs to be braised slow and low for hours to become tender, but the manager's strict schedule didn't allow for that. We had to prep it to be roasted quickly at the venue, which meant it was gonna be incredibly tough and chewy. We made the sauce using the canned mushrooms and the fake truffle flavoring. The whole kitchen smelled like a chemical factory. When our shift was over, we stopped working. There was still a mountain of prep left to do, but the manager had strictly forbidden any overtime. We cleaned our stations, clocked out and went home, and then the day of the wedding arrived. We loaded the delivery vans and drove to the venue, and the venue was a beautiful historic mansion with a massive ballroom and a large commercial kitchen in the back. The manager, aka pseudo-CEO, arrived at the venue wearing another ridiculously highly formal outfit. She walked around with a clipboard, acting important, barking orders at the serving staff, and she completely ignored the kitchen. Cocktail hour started, the serving staff carried the grazing boards out to the guests, and I watched through the kitchen doors. The guests, dressed in expensive suits and beautiful gowns, looked at the platters of cheap deli meat and canned fruit with absolute confusion. I think Gordon Ramsay would have had a heart attack in this situation. Anyway, some people took a few polite bites and then put their plates down. Most people just ignored the food entirely. The bride's mom came into the kitchen and she looked furious. She asked what was going on with the appetizers, and she said this was not what they tasted during the consultation. I kept my face completely neutral and I told her I was very sorry, but I was just following the menu and ingredient list provided by our CEO. I pointed out the manager who was standing near the bar, trying to look important. The mother of the bride stormed over to the manager. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I saw the manager turn pale and starting to stammer. She pointed towards the kitchen, clearly trying to blame me. Then came dinner service. We roasted the cheap beef, we plated it up with the fake truffle mushroom sauce, and the servers carried the plates out to the ballroom, and it was an absolute massacre. The beef was so tough that people could barely cut it with their steak knives. I saw guests sawing away at the meat, giving up, and just eating the side dishes. The dining room, which should have been filled with the happy sounds of people enjoying a great meal, was filled with the sound of silverware scraping aggressively against the plates and quiet murmurs of disgust. The servers came back into the kitchen, carrying plates that were mostly full. They told me that guests were complaining that the meat was inedible and the sauce tasted like chemicals. The manager finally panicked. She ran into the kitchen, her face flushed red. She grabbed my arm and yelled, "What did you do to the food? Why is it so tough? You ruined it." I pulled my arm away. I reached into my chef's coat and pulled out the folded formal reprimand she had given me. I opened it and held it up. "I did exactly what you ordered me to do," I said loudly, making sure the rest of the kitchen staff could hear me. "You ordered me to use this specific cut of cheap beef, and you ordered me to use canned mushrooms and artificial flavoring. You restricted our prep time so we couldn't tenderize the meat, and I followed your written instructions to the letter as you threatened to fire me if I didn't." She stared at the paper. She knew she was trapped. She tried to backtrack. "Well, you should have known how to cook it better. You're the chef." "I'm a chef, but not a magician," I replied. "You cannot turn cheap shoe leather into prime rib in 45 minutes. You made these decisions. You're the CEO. This is your menu." She turned around and ran out of the kitchen. She actually went and hid in the venue's small office space near the bathrooms for the rest of the night, and finally, it was time for the wedding cake. We wheeled the massive 5-tier cake out to the center of the dance floor, and from a distance it looked okay, but when the bride and groom cut into it, the dense, heavy texture was obvious. They fed each other a bite, and the groom's face contorted slightly as the greasy artificial shortening coated his mouth. They smiled for the cameras, but they didn't take a second bite. When the cake was served to the guests, most of it was left on the tables. It was a complete and utter failure. And the wedding ended. We packed up the kitchen, drove back to the bakery. The manager had already left the venue without saying a word to anyone. The next morning, I arrived at the bakery at 6. The manager wasn't there. At 8 o'clock, the front door opened and the owner walked in, and he looked exhausted and absolutely furious. He marched straight past the front counter and into the kitchen. He looked at me and said, "I just got off the phone with the bride's father." He screamed at me for like 20 minutes. He said the food was inedible, the cake tasted like plastic, and he's refusing to pay the remaining balance. He's also threatening to sue us for ruining his daughter's wedding. What the hell happened? I wiped my hands on a towel. I asked the owner to come with me to the manager's office. We walked in, and the manager was sitting at her expensive new desk looking terrified. The owner looked at the remodeled office, and he looked at the massive desk. Then his eyes fell on a small stack of business cards sitting next to her keyboard. He picked one up. He read the gold lettering, Chief Executive Officer. He looked at the manager. "CEO? What is this?" The manager started crying. She pointed a shaking hand at me. "He ruined the wedding. He purposely cooked the food badly to make me look bad. He's insubordinate and he refuses to listen to me." The owner turned to me, but I didn't say a word. I just opened the folder I'd been keeping in my desk. I pulled out the entire stack of papers. I showed the owner the email where she declared herself the CEO. I handed him the email where she cancelled the local suppliers and mandated cheap wholesale ingredients. I also handed him the email where she changed the baking schedule, making it impossible to have fresh food in the morning. I handed him the signed papers where she forced the delivery to take the bumpy back roads. And then finally, I handed him the formal reprimand from the wedding, the document where she explicitly ordered me to use the cheap beef, the canned fruit, the fake vanilla, and the artificial shortening, and threatened to fire me if I didn't comply. The owner stood there in silence, reading through the documents one by one. His face went from red to white and back to red again, and the silence in the room was heavy. The manager was sobbing quietly, trying to formulate an excuse. The owner finished reading the last document and he placed the papers gently on the desk. He looked at the manager. "You cancel my contract with the dairy farm?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I was trying to save money," she stammered. "The profit margins." "You served canned fruit at a premium wedding?" he asked, his voice getting a little louder. "But the budget." "You declared yourself the CEO of my bakery?" he yelled. The sound echoed out into the front of the store. The manager shrank back in her chair. The owner pointed at the door. "Get out of here. Pack your things, get out of my building right now. You're fired." She tried to argue with him. She tried to say she had a contract. The owner told her that her gross negligence and destruction of company property and reputation voided any agreement they had, and he told her that if she didn't leave immediately, he would call the cops and have her removed for her trespassing. She grabbed her purse, kept her head down, and practically ran out the back door. The owner sat down heavily in the expensive ergonomic chair. He rubbed his face with his hands. He looked at me and apologized, and he said he had been so overwhelmed with his wife's illness that he hadn't been checking the business accounts or reading the daily reports, and he had trusted this manager completely, and she had almost destroyed everything he built, and I told him I understood. I told him we could fix it. And we did. The owner spent the rest of the day on the phone. He called the bride's father, apologized profusely, and completely refunded the entire cost of the wedding, including the deposit. It was a massive financial hit, but it stopped them from suing us and stopped them from destroying our reputation in the local press. And then he called our old suppliers. He begged the local dairy farm and the regional flour mill to take us back. Because he had always been a good customer in the past, they agreed to resume deliveries the following week. He threw the cheap wholesale ingredients directly into the dumpster, and we spent the next few days deep cleaning the kitchen, getting everything back to normal. And before he went back home to his wife, the owner called me into the office and he told me he still needed someone to run the business side of things, and he said he clearly couldn't trust an outsider. He offered me the position of general manager with a massive pay raise on the condition that I also keep an eye on the kitchen and make sure the quality never dropped again. I accepted. It took us a few months to win back our regular customers. We had to give away a lot of free pastries and apologize a lot, but once people tasted the real butter and the good flour again, they came back. The bakery is now more successful than ever, and we are booked solid for catering events for the next 2 years. And yeah guys, if you ask me, the manager was obviously a delusional micromanaging nightmare who had no business running a commercial kitchen, and she deserves every bit of her firing. Also, there's a special kind of arrogance required to walk into a business that you did not even build and immediately remodel the owner's office and start ordering fancy business cards for yourself. She was clearly not there to manage the bakery, she was simply there to play corporate executive dress-up. And a user from Reddit said, "As a kitchen worker, the part about the schedule change triggered my fight or flight response. There's nothing worse than a suit who has never stood on a line or prepped a prep list, trying to optimize workflow, and telling a baker to work faster to make yeast rice is like telling a pregnant woman to deliver the baby in 3 months to save on hospital room costs. The absolute audacity of some managers is just mind-blowing." Another comment on Reddit said, "I spent 8 years in food service and watched it happen twice. Someone who managed a clothing store or a hardware chain gets brought in because they supposedly have management experience, and they genuinely cannot conceive of the idea that their skills simply don't transfer. A clothing store can swap suppliers and customers won't notice, and you can tell staff to work faster and the merchandise won't become inedible. The variables are just fundamentally different here, and some people are constitutionally unable to admit that an industry they've never worked in might operate by different rules than the one they came from." And the next one is a fantastic malicious compliance story which is titled "Not My Lot, Not My Problem." So this happened decades ago when I worked for a food production company and I was the quality control manager. I regularly checked the quality of the food we produced and the food production lines for 4 plants in the area. One plant I inspected was operating within tolerance and received a generally good report, but I had to note one potential hazard. The parking lot was in a terrible condition, and the dust that employees' vehicles kicked up and they entered and left work could enter the plant and contaminate the food production line. I gave a copy of my report to the plant operations supervisor and suggested that he get it taken care of before the USDA inspector noticed it. His response was, "You were here to inspect food production, not the parking lot." "I'm here to ensure the quality of the food product that leaves this plant." "Bullcrap." And then he said the words every malicious complier thrives on, "Don't tell me how to run my plant." Well, 6 weeks later, the USDA inspector shut down the entire plant, citing the quality of the parking lot and the heightened risk of dust entering the food production line. Yeah, who knew? But even then, there was a workaround that could have kept the plant open, only plant operations had demanded that I don't tell them how to run their plant. Even so, I had to ask the following month after the lot had been repaved and the inspector had finally approved the plant to be reopened, Why didn't you just close down the parking lot and have the employees park on the street? Schedule the repave on a weekend, the plant could have stayed in operation. Well, suffice to say, he didn't lose his job, in fact he retired from that company, so I guess it was a lesson learned, but he didn't talk to me again. And yeah guys, thank you for watching, I will see you again tomorrow.